no matter where I'm at, no matter what situation I'm in, I want to believe I can fix it. I can work on it. I can develop the skills to be happier.
Use your own personal strengths and leverage those into being that kind of a leader. If you're quiet, introverted, and methodical, you're probably never going to be the charismatic, funny leader. That's just not in you. But that doesn't mean you can't be just as great of a leader, because there's many ways to slice that pie. Human beings are pretty special. We're pretty damn smart. But what makes us special is not the trillion connections inside our own brain, but the fact that we can now connect that to all the other brains. And now we got, quadrillions of connections where ideas can get just improved as they bounce around among different humans.
How about you? How happy are you?
Well,
Bill, man, I've been a big fan of yours for a while. It's great to have you. Welcome to the Learning Leader Show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So I'm curious about your friend Steve and people like him. Why is it that someone like your buddy Steve, who has a comfortable life filled with freedom, choice, and abundance, still feels so unhappy and unfulfilled?
Yeah, that's the $64 question. And that's actually the question that motivated me to write this book was, and the truth of the matter is, I have to admit, this sounds bad, but I have to admit, it made me feel a little superior to my friend, right? Because here he is, he's this guy who's earned $1 zillion. He's showing me around his remarkable home. And then in the same breath, he's admitting he's not happier. And I remember thinking, well, if I had this kind of fortune and I were in this situation, I would be thrilled. So I have the capacity to appreciate something that you don't. And so I was feeling a little superior at the time. But and this is a common problem that we see, where people are very well-to-do are not necessarily any happier. And then what really kind of was eye-opening to me is I'm reading Frank Marlowe's book on the Hadza. It's this really wonderful ethnography on people who are direct return hunter-gatherers. They have almost nothing. They eat today what they catch today, kind of thing. And I'm reading the story about them, and they're a pre-medical society. They have no healthcare to speak of. They have no worldly goods. There's no worldly comforts either. They live in these very minimal shelters, and they bury like almost half their children before they grow up. I mean, everything is hard about their lives. And I'm realizing, holy crap, I'm a multimillionaire compared to them. And not only am I no happier than them, but on average, those guys seem like they're happier than we are. And so I realized I'm not superior to my buddy Steve. I'm no better at appreciating the good things in life than he is. And it's a worldwide problem. It's not just a problem of rich, really coddled people in our society. It's our society as a whole. There's something wrong here that's causing us not to be happy despite the enormous comforts and wealth that we have.
What are the two things that we need?
So from my perspective, the two most important motives that we have as humans are the need to connect, which is evolved from when we first left the rainforest 6 million years ago and separated from our chimp ancestors. As we moved down into the ground, we were prey for lots of animals that weren't a threat to us before, because we were up in the trees and we were just uncatchable up there. And so lots of animals could now catch us in the ground, because chimps and chimp-like animals are very slow on the ground. And so we resolved that threat by connecting with each other and cooperating. And so that's our most fundamental motive. And we have it much stronger than chimpanzees do. And in fact, my favorite evidence for the importance of connection and cooperation in human is the whites of our eyes. Chimpanzees are they're cognitively very clever. They can discern what you're looking at by looking at your face, and then they can look over there themselves, which lots of other animals can't do that. They're not smart enough. But chimps disguise what they're looking at by having brown eyes. Their entire eye is brown, so it's harder for another chimp to figure out where they're looking. Now, the whites of my eyes advertise the direction of my gaze. The second I look over there, you say, oh, Bill's looking lower left. And so what that tells me is that my ancestors benefited by advertising what was going on in their minds, because other ancestors would have helped them. If that was a threat, they would help them deal with the threat. If it was an opportunity, they would help them grab that opportunity. And chimps are the opposite. The other ancestors were a competition. If they were looking over there, they would compete to get it first, or they would run away faster, or whatever. And so cooperation is just baked into our physiology. It's baked into our psychology. That's our most important need. Now, that's not the only need we have, though, of course. And what I would argue is the second most important need is the need for autonomy, the need to be self-governing, to direct ourselves. And the reason that matters so much for humans is that we have so many routes to success. If we're like a dung beetle, all we do in life is roll a big ball of poo. And if the bigger the ball of poo, the more successful we are. There's one goal. You don't need a sense of autonomy to say, today I'm going to roll a ball of poo, right? That's just your job. But if you're a human, like let's say that you and I are in the same group and I'm thinking, oh, I've got to do something to differentiate myself from Ryan so that a mate will choose me, or the guys will want me to hunt with them instead of him. But Ryan's a better hunter. I keep practicing, but he just does better than I do. Maybe I could be a better arrow maker. And so my sense of self-governance allows me to choose a path where I think I have the best prospects for, standing out in a positive way in my group. So on the one hand, I have a need to connect. And on the other hand, I have a need to differentiate myself, to self-govern, to go my own way so that I can, in the end, come back to connection and be of value. But that's my route to get there, to find my own pathway. Those, I believe, are our two most important needs.
So when it comes to the first one, how does the Harvard study, right? The Grant and Gluck, the Harvard longitudinal study over, I guess, maybe 90 or 100 years, studying lots and lots of people, right? And it feels to me like the simplification of that study was that what leads to a happy life was love, relationships, connection, which is part of your answer. How does that study play into the work that you do as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the thing is that we've got this unfortunate battle between these two forces, because to the degree that I connect, I have to set aside what I personally want. And so I want to practice my arrow making today, but you say to me, hey, Bill, come on, we'll go for a hunt, or we'll go out to the lake and see what's going on, whatever. And I have to now compromise. I've got a relationship with you. And so that requires me to put my needs sometimes, at least, in the backseat. And then the other way around, if I want to express my autonomy, unless it happens to be exactly what you want to do, then my relationships are going to suffer. And so these two things are in tension with each other. And the problem is that when we pursue self-improvement, when we try to follow our own pathway, we disconnect a little bit. And if we remember that the whole reason we evolved this need for autonomy is to be of greater value to our group, then we could step back and say, all right, I do want to work hard. I do want to self-improve. I do want to do those things, but they're in service of my relationship goals. They shouldn't replace them. And for many of us, they do the opposite. They replace them. And the Harvard study is a great example, because what you've got is a bunch of really high achieving folks who can go out and do anything, their autonomy is well served. They become successes in life. But in the end of the day, is that what makes them happy? No, it turns out that being a success doesn't make you happy in and of itself. Being a success only makes you happy if it facilitates your connections, if it allows you to then go back and be a better parent, a better brother, a better friend, the kinds of things, because now you're successful in life and you have resources and you're comfortable, et cetera. And so the Harvard study is really a nice example of material success for its own sake gets you almost nowhere. It's only valuable to the degree that it then serves our need to connect with each other.
I can't help myself. You're a guy who studies this stuff for a living. How about you? How happy are you?
Well, I have the good fortune that I have a very strong, what I would call, a positivity offset. We, a lot of happiness is just genetic. And so if you get lucky, and in that genetic lottery, you've got what we call a polygenic score. And so we used to think that one or two genes had a big impact. And now we know that thousands, even millions of genes have a small impact. And so what we do is we build these things called polygenic scores, where we add in all the genes that matter and we just weight them by how much they matter, because each one only plays a tiny role. In Robert Plomin's terms, we thought we had gold nuggets, but we have gold dust. So lots of little dust determines your outcome, right? And I have the good luck that a lot of my dust landed on the happy side of the equation. And so, when things are humming along as they always do, I just generally am happy in my day-to-day existence, probably more so than my friends might even find mildly annoying.
Wait, so you're saying like this nature versus nurture thing when it comes to happiness is it's just kind of wild to think about, man. In some ways it's upsetting. In other ways, it's like, okay, because like my whole thing is I'm a learning leader, right? It's the name of the show.
Right.
No matter where I'm at, no matter what situation I'm in, I want to believe this is really growth focused, growth mindset stuff, right? I really want to believe I can fix it. I can work on it. I can develop the skills to be happier. I can, but I'm thinking about this. Can you go a little bit deeper on this?
Yeah.
You're born with it in this this
So,
polygene score. Is that the right
yeah,
phrase? Is that how
polygenic. Yeah. So
polygenic
yeah,
score? Okay, yeah.
polygenic. So this you ask a great question. So let me back up a tiny bit. When we do the behavioral genetics, we can do it both molecular genetics, where we actually look for the genes, and we're getting really really good at that. They're called GWAS, genetic wide association studies, where you look at every gene in your entire body. We're
Wow.
getting really good at that. But what we're better at is just saying, okay, you're an identical twin versus a fraternal twin. Therefore, we know that you're 100% related versus 50% related. And then we can track how much your traits go in common. And so that literature is more developed because genes are complicated. There's so many of them, and they also interact with each other in ways we don't understand. So let's set aside the molecular genetics, but we can come back to that. All right. So if we look at these twin studies, what they teach us is that across the spectrum, from happiness to health to longevity to intelligence to friendliness, agreeableness, anything you want, on average, 50 years of research has shown us that about half of your trait is determined by your genes. About
Wow.
half.
Wow.
I know. And so, but you raise an excellent point. So wait a minute. I'm a believer that I've got a growth mindset that I can do something about it. Well, half is still a lot left, right? And
Yeah.
so, if you look at some guys go to the gym, they lift one weight and they're suddenly jacked, and they're like, "What happened to you?" And other guys go to the gym every day and it hardly has any effect. And so, you can still get stronger by going to the gym every day. But if you have the good luck that your genes are power genes, you're going to build really big muscles really easily. So let's look at this in terms that really matter. If you look at the genetics of obesity, about it's unfortunate, but it's true in today's world, and it'll vary by the foods we eat. But in today's world, about 70% of your weight is determined by your genes. You have control over less than half of it, if by control you mean your behaviors. Now, genes always interact with the environment, and so we know full well. Like when I was a little kid back in the 70s, almost nobody was obese. And now obesity is a huge problem. And so what that really is telling us, it's not that you have a gene to be obese, but that you have a gene that makes you or genes that make you very sensitive to modern foods or lifestyles or something like that make it highly likely for you to become obese. So that will change over time. But for now, what we know in today's world, obesity is highly genetically determined. Yet, if we do a polygenic score on you, so we look at your molecular genetics, and we say, do you have genes to be thin, to be middleweight, or to be overweight? We can see that they're hugely powerful. You're most likely to be what your genes are. But what you're second most likely to be is in the direction you want to be away from your genes. So if you have obese genes, or let's put you in the overweight category. If you have genes to be overweight, you're more likely to be thin than you are to be obese. Because of course people want to be thin, they want to work hard at it. And so you're right, that growth mindset matters a ton. It's just that for some people, if God endows you out of good luck with thin genes, it's effortless. You eat a bunch of potato chips, you go for a light walk, and Bob's your uncle, you're nice and thin. But if you've got the bad luck to have obese genes, it's hard yards to get there. But people do, and they're more likely to get there than they are to stay where they don't want to be.
Man, I learned this firsthand when I went to college. I played football in college, Bill, and a couple of my teammates, I've been lifting weights heavy. My dad had us in the basement since probably seventh-ish grade. And I think we have pretty good genes, but nothing like some of the guys I played with in college. And I remember the very first day at Miami University, my freshman year, they have us test, like to get a baseline squat, bench, cleans, all this stuff. They want you to max out that first day just to kind of see where you're at. Yep. So hopefully then the strength coach can show you go through my program and you get way stronger, which is usually what happens. Some of my teammates had never even been in a weight room before, had never lifted a weight. They were really good players. They had insane muscles, like their bodies were jacked, never lifted weights. And I remember one of them, a defensive back who ended up going on to play in the NFL later when we got done with college. He squatted like 500 pounds on the first day when he had never lifted his weight. And I remember I'm like struggling to get 375 or something. I've been lifting my whole life essentially. And I was like, geez, man, like they're just built different. Like you were just came out like built different. He's a great player, good attitude, everything, hard worker, but like just didn't lift weights, yet was massively strong. And he actually weighed less than I did, but massively stronger just from genetics. And it was so frustrating, honestly, to watch.
Yeah. it is frustrating, but it's also empowering, right? Because you're
Yeah.
like, wow, that's a great role model. I may never be able to get there, but like it's nice that somebody can, right? I remember I was traveling with my son in Ghana, and West Africans tend, on average, to have higher quick jerk musculature. There's just big ethnic differences. And across Africa, you've got some ethnic groups that are thin and tall, and some that are heavy and strong. And West Africans tend to have heavy musculature. So there we are in Ghana. These guys are not lifting weights because they don't have much money. They're just carving wood and eating, relatively poorly compared to an American athlete. And every one of those guys is completely jacked. And my son's like, Dad, look at these guys. How are they so strong? And I said, well, they got good luck, right? They've got genes for power.
What do we do about
So
this though? Like when not just with being jacked, but like just in general, for because this is a growth focused group we got here, Bill. Like these are people who firmly believe I can do the work to be happier. I can do the work to be a better leader. I can do a work to make a positive impact in the world. What do you say to that person when some of this genetic stuff can bum people out? Like, well, maybe I just got the wrong end of the stick. Maybe I'm not set up to be happy. Like, what's your advice to them?
yeah, so that's a great question. And my answer is this. First of all, remember that more people who have overweight genes are thin than are obese. And so you can fight against your genes and you can win. It's just you have to understand it's a daily fight. And
Yeah.
so that guy with overweight genes works a lot harder than the guy who has thin genes to be at the exact same place that they both are.
Mm-hmm.
That's answer one. But answer two is sometimes what you ought to be thinking about is, all right, what's my path of genetic least resistance? Where do my strengths lie and where do my weaknesses lie, and how can I work around my weaknesses? So we know, for example, that if you look at self-control, people of high self-control have way better outcomes across their entire lives than people who are low in self-control. In fact, effective self-control are stronger than the effects of IQ. It matters more that you can control yourself than that you're super duper smart. But when we look at the daily lives of people with high self-control and ask how they do it, it turns out it's super interesting. They don't stare down the bag of potato chips and say, I'm not eating you, I'm not eating you, and they resist temptation. They don't do that at all. Rather, they avoid temptation. So there are no potato chips in their house. They don't even walk down that aisle in the grocery store. They do the things that they need to do in order to design their lives in ways that they can be a success. And what that means is that you have to know your own strengths and weaknesses. You come back to the Socratic know thyself thing. And so if you know yourself and you know, okay, here's the 5 things that I do really poorly. Here's the areas where I struggle. How can I design my life so that I can make those as minimal of a handicap as possible? Because we all can. And one way to do that is, well, don't pursue, I have got a growth mindset. I'm going to be great, but don't push so hard against something that's just not in your wheelhouse. In my own case, I'm the worst basketball player who ever lived. Well, I'm a towering 5'6". It's no surprise, right? And so why should I waste my time on the basketball court unless I just really enjoy to play? Put my effort somewhere else. And so yes, you can be great at anything you want to be great at, but some things you're going to be greater at than others. And sometimes you can take a different route to greatness because you're, instead of trying to push through where your genes are against you, push a route where your genes actually help you out.
How about for leadership? The question that's brought up a lot to me: are leaders born or are they made? And of course, the answer is probably a bit of both. But I am always like, well, we can make them though. We can make them. Listen to this. Like, we'll work with you. We could, like, I really lean heavy to we can make you. We can work on it. We can get better. It's not necessarily a born thing. Where do you stand? Are leaders born or made?
I agree with you that they're both, but I would answer it ever so slightly differently to say there's many ways to be a great leader. And so if I'm funny and charismatic, leverage that strength. Use my humor and my charisma as part of my leadership to draw people to my cause. If I'm organized and methodical, use that strength. Always have every morning at the start of the day, everybody on the team knows exactly what needs to be done. Their jobs are easy. Everything's set up for them. Use your own personal strengths and leverage those into being that kind of a leader. If you're quiet, introverted, and methodical, you're probably never going to be the charismatic, funny leader. That's just not in you. But that doesn't mean you can't be just as great of a leader, because there's many ways to slice that pie. It comes back to the fact, again, that we're not dung beetles. You can achieve your goals in so many different ways. There's so many ways to be a successful, empowering, important leader, just like there's so many ways to be a successful, empowering, important person, that just leverage your strengths and try to do things that minimize the impact of your weaknesses.
How have you, or what have you done to understand your strengths, to know yourself better? What type of reflective work, what questions, what prompts? How have you gotten good at understanding where you're at, what you should be doing, and how to lean into your strengths?
Yeah, that's hard. And a big part of the reason it's hard is that we evolved to self-deceive. I believe that I'm Bill plus 20%. And why do I believe that? Because the regular Bill wouldn't get all the things in life that the person I am wants to have. And so if I believe that I'm 20% more than I really am, I can probably get away with it. And so when I come into a confrontation with you, if we're evenly matched, but I'm Bill plus 20 and I look like I believe it, you say to yourself, I better back off. This guy seems pretty confident and he knows himself better than I do. And so what it comes down to is whenever conspecifics, members of the same species, come into conflict with each other, they don't actually want to fight. What they want to do is know who would win. And so if you and I come up to the same bar stool, we just want to know who's going to win this fight over this bar stool. And then I don't want to get punched, nor do I want to punch you, because both of them hurt. Both of them are cellular costs. Let's know the answer and avoid the conflict, and one of us will defer. And we see that across the animal kingdom. But of course, what that means is now that there's space to claim to be more than you are, so that I get you to back off when you really are the stronger person. And it should be your bar stool because I've convinced you that I'm not to be trifled with. And what it comes down to is that we all end up being about self plus 20. And the test that you can do to see if this describes you is just ask yourself this question. When my friends take a candid photo of me where I'm not posing, I didn't know the photo was being taken, what are the chances that I like that photo?
Zero.
And in my case, yeah, exactly. It's like 5% at best. And I'm like, what are my friends sadistic? They're taking these terrible pictures of me. Well, no, they're not. That's what I actually look like. But in my mind's eye, I'm a better looking guy than that because when I walk by the mirror, I only get that perfect angle or perfect lighting. And that's the picture that I post and I look at the most. Yep. And so I'm self-deceiving to think I'm better looking, stronger, smarter, nicer, whatever. So why is that a problem? Well, part of the reason that's a problem is that it gets me things in life, so I do it. But now it makes it really hard for me to look objectively at myself and say, well, what do I suck at? And the truth is that we all suck at everything. Well, lots of things. We don't all suck at everything. That's not true at all. And so for me, the eye-opening moment was when I started graduate school and I'm in this seminar with all my fellow PhD students, brand new, I know nothing. And I asked this professor a question and he answers it. And then other people are asking him other questions. And suddenly I'm realizing, boy, if we look at all the answers to all the questions, what he said earlier to my answer must be wrong because the way he's answered these other questions. So I said, wait a minute. It seems based on what you just said that what you earlier said was wrong. And he goes, oh, you're absolutely right. I was wrong before when I said that. It's not that. And he just did this right in front of the class on day one. And so I sought him out to be my supervisor. It's like a guy who can just admit he's wrong in front of a class full of students who know nothing. That's a scientist who I want to learn from because he's humble, right? He wants to know the truth. He's not trying to put his ego first. And it's hard. And I just tried to do that every day. When somebody asks me a question, my first instinct is to defend my theory. And then I try to push my second, all right, wait a minute. I know I'm trying to defend the theory, and that's good because you should rigorously try to defend your ideas. But I also need to stop and see, is there value in their criticism? Because usually there is, right? And so it's this battle you fight with yourself every day. But I've gotten really good at just trying to model his behavior and say, well, when I'm wrong, just admit it as quickly as possible, fix it, and move on.
How comfortable are you responding to a question by saying, I don't know?
Well, I used to not be good at that at all because I felt like that was a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
And so I gave this talk. I was in Amsterdam, actually, on this, giving a series of academic talks. And this professor comes up to me afterwards, this big deal guy, and he goes, I really loved your answer to this question. And I couldn't remember anymore. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't remember how I answered that question. He goes, you said you didn't know. I was like, oh, I was kind of embarrassed, but I don't know. He goes, no, people never say that. It's really nice when you can just say you don't know. And I was pretty early in my career, and I was like, oh, it never occurred to me that was a plus. I felt like I'd been boxed into a corner, and I had no choice but to say I didn't know. When here's this eminent person telling me that was the best answer you gave all day. And so again, it's surprising how people respond to admissions of humility and lack of knowledge and error. But by and large, they respond much more positively than you think they will. And by and large, those are actually admission. Those are strong things to do, to admit you're wrong rather than weak things. And the farther I go in my career, the more happy I am to say I'm wrong and I don't know, because I am wrong and I don't know.
Well, do you know what people really respond to? Authenticity, real. They whether it's a coach in sports, a teacher, a podcast, I just sense this kind of fake, inauthentic, tough guy leader mantra that some people have that I've worked for. I'm thinking of one right now. I'm sure everybody can. Doesn't work, right? You have a coach who's trying to be like the other coach, maybe that mentored them instead of being like figuring themselves out and then, taking bits and pieces from other coaches and then mashing it together with their personality to still be authentically them. Yes, that's the good thing to do.
Yep.
But I would love to hear what you think about this idea, because I sense it from you. I've sensed it from the second we connected on Zoom and you got here early, and just the way you've talked about why you moved to Australia, like everything. Like I just sensed this, like, oh, this guy's just real. He's authentic. He's just kind of saying what he thinks and what he believes. He's not trying to put on a show. What is it about authenticity that is just so attractive?
Well, remember what I said earlier, that we all are trying to be ourselves plus 20%, right?
Yep.
And that's a deceptive strategy to get more things in life than you would get otherwise. It's kind of the equivalent of lying. It's overconfidence. And and we all do this. And I'm just as guilty as the next guy of doing this. But I'm 61 years old, right? So I've been down this road a long time. And over that, one of the nice things that age gives you is you become more comfortable with who you are and what you are and are not going to achieve, right? You're not going to get some of those things that you wanted, and you will get others, and you learn to be satisfied with that. And so, yes, what we really resonate to is people who we think are telling us the truth. And it's hard to tell the truth, particularly when you're in the early stages of the game. But I think you hit the nail on the head. And that is, when you go through life, you're going to have mentors and teachers who have lots of great strategies. And some of those are going to fit you well. And you should incorporate them. Just literally steal them, because nobody is going to take your class and their class. Nobody's going to be your employee and theirs. It just doesn't happen, right? And so borrow, that's the most sincere form of flattery. Borrow the things from your mentors that actually resonate with you, that you think you could do and make sense to you, but don't try to pretend to be something you're not. I've had so many awesome professors who are just things that I'm not. And I go, well, I wish I could do that, but I can't. And so you let it go, right?
Well, I read that you did a study, I believe, in 2017 on overconfidence. What did you learn from that study on overconfidence?
Well, so overconfidence is a strategy that we use, and we do it we do it under a variety of circumstances. We do it when we think that it's going to benefit us. And so if I'm communicating with you in a way where my confidence will come across, then I'm going to do that. I'm going to puff myself up in a way that gets you to see me as something more than I really am. But we're strategic about it. If I'm in a context with you where that's not going to work, I don't do it. And what's really remarkable about it is that we believe our own story. Sometimes we know we're bluffing. I'm playing poker. I got a terrible hand. You can't see it. I'm just going to go for it. But most of the times in life, we believe the stories we tell ourselves. And so that's why we do a lot of things that might otherwise seem kind of illogical. So for example, we often avoid seeking additional information if we're worried it might be bad news. Mm-hmm. Like, so the simple version is I've been trying to decide forever which product to buy, and I make a purchase, and then somebody says to me, oh, you should check out their prices over across town, and I don't even want to know. Like, I've made my purchase, it's too late, right? But we do this in lots of ways where we don't. If I encounter the bad news, then I would have to admit to you, oh, I made a bad decision, and maybe I'm not as good of a leader as you thought, or as decision maker, or whatever. And so we try to organize our lives where we minimize the degree to which we get that bad news. And that allows us to believe our own stories. And that's important, because it does determine who's successful in life. Because Bill is who he is. He can try to improve himself, but it's a whole lot easier just to bluff and bluster his way through than it is to actually self-improve. Self-improve's hard work. Bluster is easy. And so if I can get myself to believe my bluster, I'll go a long way. And you can think of politicians who are full of bluster, and it works, right? And leaders as well.
Does it work?
It doesn't. Well, it works for the short term.
Okay.
And
yes.
somebody eventually pops that bubble, and unfortunately the whole thing can collapse. But again, because it's easier to do the bluster than it is to do the hard yards of getting it right, it's a
Yeah.
strategy that people are always going to pursue. And so the for me, the thing is that, we can't help ourselves. That's just in our nature to be overconfident. And it works. It attracts members of the opposite sex, it attracts coalition partners, it does the things that are evolutionarily important. But if you lean on it too hard, you can someday find yourself like, I would have been far better off spending these ensuing years self-improving and
Yeah.
actually now having the skills that allow me to do what I want to do rather than pretending for so many years.
Yeah, I think real confidence needs evidence. So you just got to go do the thing and create some evidence for yourself. I am
Yeah.
fascinated. How did you meet your wife? What was that? What was that story like?
Oh, so
I'm thinking of
that's
being
not,
overconfident in these situations. Maybe I'm
yeah.
projecting a bit here, Bill, but I'm curious about the
No,
story for
in
you.
that particular case, it wasn't an overconfidence case. I was a young academic at Ohio State, and she was a student in my lab, and so she approached me and asked me if, sort of asked me out, but in a way that has enough ambiguity so that, it wouldn't be awkward if I said no. And I didn't know if as a
She
this
was
is my
overconfident.
she she was. This is 30 some years ago. And so I actually went to there's an ombudsperson, and I said, am I allowed to date a student? And they said, yes, so long as it's not your student. But they said, if it goes pear-shaped, it's on you. No matter what happened, the university will blame you. So just keep that in mind if you're going to go down that road. So it wasn't, that's a slightly different kind of case. But I can tell you that, I if I look at myself, here's for example. I remember when I was trying to grow a beard the first time, and it looked a little bit like moss on the south side of a north-facing tree. I mean, it was this patchy, ridiculous thing, and but I was keen to see what it would look like if I could literally grow it out. And so I was like 16 or something, right? And so I'd be at the shops, and I'd be kind of flirting with the person behind the counter, maybe, and it'd all be going fine. And then I'd suddenly remember that I have this absurd looking growth on my face. I would just clam up and get nervous, and it would all go, it would go awry. And so you need to believe in yourself, even if you shouldn't, because I shouldn't have at that point. I looked ridiculous, but by believing in myself, it went smoothly anyway.
Yes, I know that feeling as a quarterback, especially a younger quarterback, and the power of coaches
Yeah.
pouring and adding confidence on you that maybe you shouldn't even have, but the coach needs you to have it because you're
Yes.
his guy.
Yeah.
You're our quarterback. And they pump you up so much to the fact where you start believing it, and then hopefully you make a play or two, and then you've created some evidence for yourself, and
Yes.
then you're kind of riding high. The problem is if you keep that kind of ego for the rest of your life outside of, because I think you need a little ego as a quarterback. When you get on the field, you got to feel like the baddest dude on that field. It's part of the deal. You've seen Baker Mayfield and Tom Brady and these guys. They're the baddest dudes on that field, and they kind of need that edge. The problem is if you let that carry off of the field, you can run into some problems. You can make poor decisions. You could treat people maybe not as
Yeah.
equals, and I think that could be an issue. I have a question, Bill, about a phrase that is said often that I'm not sure how I feel about it. And that is fake it till you make it. What do you think of fake it till you make it?
Yeah. So I think that's actually good advice under most circumstances. There's going to
Really?
be domains. Yeah, there's going to be domains that are too important, and you have to ask yourself, what are the costs of success versus failure, the relative costs. And sometimes failure has such a high price, and success has such a low benefit that you don't want to risk the failure to gain a little bit of success. But in the front end of any job, when you first start out, people need to believe in you. And so I remember when I was a brand new assistant professor at Ohio State, I'm like, 27 years old. I know very little compared to all my colleagues. And I remember getting an argument with this lovely guy who was a senior colleague of mine. And in retrospect, there's no question in my mind he was right and I was wrong. But I didn't know at the time. And I just looked completely confident. And I remember when we walked out, it was a fun argument. It wasn't a mean one or anything. But we walked out of that meeting, and essentially half the students had decided with me and half had sided with him because they couldn't tell. And I just looked like I was perfectly confident and going back and forth with him. And so it allowed me not to be humiliated in a circumstance where I probably would deserve a little humiliation. But at the front end of your career, it's like you going out on the field as a quarterback. A little humiliation doesn't actually help when you're already nervous and have an imposter syndrome and worried that maybe this isn't for you. You need that little bit of boost, even if there's some untruth to it, so long as you're not doing neurosurgery where the costs of getting it wrong are super duper high.
Super interesting. Many leaders are like, let's say for those who are at like the top end or the higher part of their companies, or the CEO, they're the owner, SVP, right? Lots of people. Those jobs are lonely. I work with those leaders. They often can be lonely. They don't necessarily have people they can go to that are their peers or equals. They may have one or two. In some cases, they have none, though, and so they can struggle with this isolation, right? They probably have some autonomy, but they need more meaningful connections. So what advice would you give to those leaders who are at or near the top, where they're isolated, it's a bit lonely, and they're lacking in connections?
Yeah. So your individual circumstances obviously are going to be particularly important in cases like that. And from my perspective, you have to step back and ask yourself, well, how did we evolve and where did we come from, and how would our ancestors deal with that problem? And the way our ancestors dealt with that problem is that there was never one overall overarching leader. And when we talk about immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, which is where we started, there are people who don't have any gardens. Everything changed once agriculture and those things came around, and not necessarily in good ways. But if we look at how we started and how we spent 99% of our time as a species, you might be the hunt leader today, I might be the song leader, I might be the medicine leader, and so nobody was peerless. Everybody had somebody else who was as good or better in other domains. And so from my perspective, they're very happy people. And they always felt like they had someone to talk to and bounce advice off and stuff like that, because they weren't at the tip of the spear in every domain. You could run a company or a sports team or whatever and be the number one person across all the domains, even though really your expertise is in one particular domain. But now that's your company, you're the CEO, whatever. And so, from my perspective, what you need is a group of people that you actually trust and that you trust and you enjoy their company, ideally. And those are the people that you ought to be bouncing ideas off all the time. And what the data show most clearly, so to back up a tiny bit, and this is something that you might already be very familiar with, but you might not have run into it. When Google does everything in teams, and they're super data oriented. And so they eventually decided, boy, we've run thousands of teams. We collect a ton of data on how all the teams, what's going on in the team. And we also know how well the team succeeded, how well the product worked out. Let's see if we can predict that success. And the single most important variable that predicted the success of Google teams across all the teams they'd ever run was what's called psychological safety, or the degree to which members of the team felt like they could be themselves and say what's really on their mind. And so what you want to do is create a group of people, if you're a CEO, who feel psychologically safe saying, Bob, you're full of shit. That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard, and here's why. And people are afraid to tell Bob he's full of shit if he's their boss. And so I don't know how to build that team. I can't give any advice on who those people are and where they come from. But if you enjoy their company, and if you value their opinion, now you've got that group that our hunter-gatherer ancestors always had, because they always were leaders in different domains. And so they always had each other to bounce ideas off and talk to. And it makes you less lonely. And it also makes you do a better job. That's what the Google data shows. Human beings are pretty special. We're pretty damn smart. But what makes us special is not the trillion connections inside our own brain, but the fact that we can now connect that to all the other brains. And now we got, quadrillions of connections where ideas can get just improved as they bounce around among different humans.
What are some practical ways, CEO, for example, what are some practical ways a CEO can create psychological safety at their company?
You could tell people, for example, in every meeting that we hold, you have to disagree with me at least once. And you have to have reason for disagreeing. You can't just say, Bob, I disagree. You have to say, Bob, I think that's wrong. And here's the data why I think that that's a bad idea. And so if the rule is that I have to do it at least once, well, then everybody's going to do it. And it becomes a norm. And B, if I disagree with you, it's not because I don't like you. It's not because I don't trust you. It's not because I don't value your leadership. It's because that's the rules of engagement. And so whenever you create rules of engagement that require disagreement, or you could play the devil's advocate, somebody gets assigned that role every meeting. You choose how you want to do it. But the key ingredient is disagreement. And look, it's important to put it in its place. If you divide decisions into their component processes, they really come into two different phases. You've got what we call deliberation and then implementation. And deliberation is when we're all sitting around saying, well, what should we do? Do we introduce this new product? Do we go after our competitor? Whatever. And so that's the time for disagreement. That's the time when everybody should pipe in and give opposite things. Then once we agree on the answer, now we're implementing. And now nobody wants to hear your disagreement with the original goal anymore. That time has passed. And so you have to be sensible about the nature of the disagreement. Once you decide, let's say that there's 10 of us and we have to decide whether we're going to introduce this new product. And I'm dead set against it. And during the deliberation phase, that's my job. I keep telling you why it's a bad idea. All right, fine. We've now decided 8-2, we're going to do it. I have to put that aside. I'm not arguing anymore we shouldn't do it. Now we're implementing. Now we just have to decide the best way to actually make it happen. And so a good board member puts aside their concerns about stage one because they've been overruled and now focuses on stage two and does their best to say, well, if we're going to do this, how can we do it the best we possibly can? And so what you want to do is build teams where people do disagree, but of course they have to disagree in the ways that make sense by virtue of the decision stage that you're at in the process.
Disagree and commit. That's huge. Great teams are able to disagree and then commit, even if they choose not
absolutely.
your. The one thing, though, Bill, I think is important when I'm working with leaders, we talk about this specific area when it comes to feedback. When you're the CEO or the senior leader, and let's say you get feedback that is critical of you or critical of how you're running something from someone who works for you, a peer, anybody, I think it is so important how you receive it, the feedback you give to them, the response you give to them. Because I've had bosses, we've probably all had bosses who say, I love feedback. Give it to me. Disagree. Tell me when I'm wrong, right? We probably all had that person. And then you do it and you give them some critical feedback that is honest and real, and it could be helpful. And they get super defensive and they start explaining why you're wrong. When that happens to me, and I'm the subordinate in this case, giving feedback, I immediately say, all right, not doing that again. He can't handle it. He can't do he says he wants it. He's lying. I don't trust him as much. He can't handle it. So as leaders, sometimes that stings. Sometimes when someone gives us critical feedback, it hurts our ego, or we really believed in the thing and now they're telling us that we're wrong, and there's a chance that they're right. Right? There's a chance that feedback's good. So what do you think about that for the leaders who then say they want it? What are the best ways for them to receive it in a way to continue to have a culture of psychological safety?
Yeah, look, it's super difficult because we all feel that sting when we make a mistake or have an idea that everybody shoots down. The only thing I would say is that practice in receiving negative feedback is key. And I reflect back on my own dad as for example. He was the perfect father for somebody who wants to take negative feedback because he dissociated two things. Every idea I ever had in my life was stupid as far as he was concerned. He would always shoot it down. But at the same time, he made it clear that he thought I was a wonderful guy. And so I learned that, my idea and me are two very different things. And yes, every idea is imperfect and every idea can be improved, but that's not a statement about me. I'm this lovely guy who he thinks the world of, who just happened to say a stupid thing yet again, right? Or not a stupid thing, but an imperfect thing. And so if you learn, all right, well, my ideas are not me, and what will make the best me is the one who has the best ideas that are the most successful. It's not an easy lesson to learn. It's a painful one that you have to go through time and time again. And I don't blame leaders. They say they want feedback because what they're really hoping is that you'll say, oh, I love the idea, but maybe make it a blue one instead of a red one. They want tweaks on the margins. They want the overall idea to be appreciated. And that's not necessarily the accurate feedback, because maybe the problem is actually the idea itself and not the margins. It's just that it's harder than people realize for us to take on that negative feedback. And I would say there's nothing like practice to make you better at it. And the way to practice it is to actually require it. And so if you go back to the earlier point that we were making, if the rules of every meeting are every person has to criticize at least one thing, or there's always a devil's advocate whose job the entire meeting is to disagree and say, what about X? Then you will guarantee you're going to get practice at dealing with it, because it's going to happen every time you and your team get together.
I think you just got to be so intentional in those moments. Like, as the leader, everyone's paying really close attention to how you respond to things. Good news, bad news, feedback, praise. People are paying really close attention to you. And so it's really critical that you're aware of that, that you're really intentional. You're not fake, right? I'm not saying don't be a phony or don't have like a fake response. Be authentically you, but just be aware of the situation when you're in a meeting or you're with your people, that the way that you choose to respond, just like as a dad, I know this feeling, the way that I handle adversity within my family is going to reverberate throughout all my children and my extended family. They're paying attention to see how I handle that
Yeah.
situation. I remember when I got pulled over for speeding, my intentional thought was be kind and be honest. Be kind and be honest to the police officer, right? Don't lie, right? Don't be
Yeah.
mean, don't be agitated. I really wanted them to see, man, this sucks. I hate that I got pulled over, but I'm going to be kind. I'm going to be honest, because that's what I want them to be when adversity strikes. And I just think that's important from a leadership perspective, as of being very thoughtful and intentional of how you respond to any stimulus, because those people are watching closely.
You're absolutely right. People pay way more attention to somebody above them in the hierarchy than they do to somebody below, because the person above them has things that they can give you or opportunities, and the person below typically doesn't. It's just human nature. Now, the thing is that what that does mean is, so if you're the above, and let's say I'm running our team and you tell me, Bill, that idea sucks, it's a non-starter, and here's why. There's no harm in my starting it going, ouch, okay. Now, what I really ought to do after I admit that that feedback hurts is I should pause for a second and ask myself, okay, is there value here or is he wrong? Because a good leader has to go ahead anyway, even if their team members disagree with them. If they're convinced they're right, if they're considering the other argument but disagreeing, they have to put it on the line and do it anyway, right? That's their job. That's literally what their job description is. And so, but what you want to be able to do is pause for a second and say, well, hold on, is that criticism valuable, and ought I take it on board and either abandon the whole project or amend it in some way, et cetera? And in my mind, when everybody's looking at you, there's only one way to do that, and that is first admit, ouch, and then say, give me a second to think that through, and then go, actually, no, that's not a problem, and here's why. Or you may be right. Let's back up and rethink this.
Yeah. I think it's also important just to thank people for giving you feedback. Say thank you. Like, even if you don't have an immediate response, you create a little bit of a buffer, but like just be genuinely grateful when someone chooses to give, because not all feedback's going to be right, by the way. Like, it's not, they're not always going to be right, but I do think you should show gratitude. I'm curious, you brought up your dad. What was your dad also genetically a happier person? Like, what was your dad like? What was your upbringing like with your dad?
Yeah, so he's a genetically happy guy, but he's also he was this sort of young and aggressive bulldozer type person. He was a chest surgeon and he couldn't get along with anybody. And so he literally moved the family to Alaska because it's sort of wide open spaces, and you can you don't have to be as political up there and get along with everybody. He just wasn't very good at getting along. He's kind of a disagreeable person. But at his heart, he was a genuinely good guy and a very happy guy. He had too much work because he was the only heart surgeon in the state. So anyone who got in a car accident or stabbed or shot or just a cardiac arrest went to him. But when he could, when he had time away, this is the 1960s and 70s, so dads are busy in those. They don't spend time with the family the way they do now. But when he had time away, he always wanted to go skiing with us or go ice skating or do something, that we would all get together and kind of, Steve, life is a ton of fun, and you ought to take those moments and enjoy them when you can.
Hmm. What was it like growing up in Alaska?
Okay, it's in some ways it's just like anywhere else except darker and colder. It's not that different from Minnesota or Maine or any of those places. The big thing is that at least when I was a kid, there was so little infrastructure that it's a great place if you like to do things on your own in backwoods. And my dad, that was his thing. So we would just go to a mountain that there was not a single human on it. We're in the middle of nowhere. And then we would ski up it and ski down it. That was our whole day, because it takes a long time to climb a mountain where the snow is 20 feet deep. And so, if you don't enjoy those kinds of activities, you're in the wrong place.
Hmm. And you go from Alaska to eventually Australia.
Yeah.
Walk me through. I know we briefly talked about it before we recorded, but walk me through the decision to move to Australia.
Well, so I'm first of all, I'm soft and weak weather-wise. I don't like to be cold anymore at all, ever. And
So you kind of
so
grew out
I,
of that, like you grew up tough and
yeah,
strong, and I can handle the
well,
cold and ski anywhere. But now that's gone.
I look, I could do it, and I was tougher as a kid than I was an adult, which is weird. But I always was cold. I always felt cold. And so I remember walking to school in the morning and it's always dark. And so you would know how cold it is by how crunchy the snow feels under your feet because there's mostly snow, but is it soft snow and forgiving or is it this gritty, cold, icy, horrible stuff and that just goes right through your bones? Anyway, I always just liked that. And when May came around, I was thrilled that the snow was melting and the summer was here. Um, and now I'm in Brisbane, Australia, where in the winter, the high every day is 70 degrees. And that just suits me so well. But I have to admit, I'm such a weenie that when it's only 70 degrees outside, I've got a jumper on, I bundle up because I find it cold if it's below 80, 85 degrees.
How about the connection element of making a move across the world? Because I imagine you and your wife had friends, you had community, you could collaborate with people, right? You're a professor. To leave all of those relationships, and maybe I don't know if you had any in Australia or you started from zero, but I feel like that could impact happiness, right? Making a move across the world. I know they're great people down there, but still, like if you don't know any of them,
Yep.
you have no
Yep.
relationships. That could take a while. Like, what was that like from when it comes to the collaboration element and connecting with other people if you don't have a built-in network of those that you already know?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the I had the advantage that I was and we're a family with young children and lots of work to do. And so I have limited time for socializing and outside my family and I didn't know a soul. And so if ever there's a time to not know a soul, you don't want to arrive as a young single person and not know a soul because then you're bored and lonely. But if you arrive as this crazy busy person with small children, well, bored and lonely is just not in the cards, right? You're overwhelmed. And Australia is actually a kind of hard country to make friends in. And the reason for that is that unlike Americans who are very residentially mobile, Australians tend to stay in the cities that they grew up in. And so their social networks are pretty full when they're adults. They've known all the same people in the same town. They've high school friends, college friends. And so it's hard to insert a new person. You know, there's nothing wrong. They're just busy. They've got a very full network of friends. Whereas Americans move all the time and for jobs and things like that. And so they're much more open to creating new friendship networks. And so what I found was that if I look at all my best friends in Australia, some of them are native Aussies, but most of them are actually expats like myself
Oh,
who arrived, who didn't have these full friendship networks, and so who had spare time, and we would get a coffee, and then over time we became friends.
interesting. I'm curious, Bill. So you work with college students, you have for a long time. Let's say you're meeting with a recent college graduate who doesn't fully know what they want to do, other than the fact that they want to leave a positive dent in the world. What are some general pieces of life slash career advice you'd give to them?
So that's a super intimidating place to be. And it's this modern problem that never existed for our ancestors. You know, 10,000 years ago, nobody in the history of time ever asked a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because there's only one answer. I'm going to be a hunter gatherer, right? That's what every single human does. And now suddenly, not only are there a zillion jobs, there's a gazillion jobs because you could be this YouTube influencer. You could invent a new career. You can do stuff that when I was a kid just simply didn't exist. And and so on the positive side, the world's your oyster. You can be anything you want. On the negative side, though, it's a little bit like walking into a really fancy chocolate shop. And there's a gazillion chocolates sitting on the trays. They're really hard to tell apart. And the only way I would know which one I like is to literally try all of them. But I'm going to be sick if I eat more than 10 of those suckers. It's just not possible. And the line's going to build up behind me if I'm while I'm going, oh, do I want those pralines or the hazelnut? You just can't do that. And so with this overwhelming choice is actually can be a bad thing too. And there's some really nice work. For example, Sheena Iyengar and others have shown that if you give people an ice cream choice and you say, here's three flavors, they'll always pick their favorite. They're really good at that. If you give them 50 ice cream choices, they'll often pick an ice cream they don't really like because they were kind of overwhelmed by choice. And the downside of the world that we live in today is that we're kind of overwhelmed by choice. And so it's intimidating because you can't, it's not a chocolate shop. You can't keep going and try different chocolates every day for 20 days and then you'll do it, because careers are hard to try. And they often require enormous amounts of training before you get to the point where you even know what it's like. One of my daughter's good friends is, her dad is a doc, and he and I are standing around watching the kids play. And he's like, I hate my job. And I was like, really? And he goes, yeah, by the time I finished medical school, I was like, I don't think I like medicine. And he goes, but I put so much money and time into it. I thought, well, don't go back to law school or something. Give it a try. So I did. And then I got into my practice and I still don't like it. But now I've got huge expenses with my practice and I'm doing really well, but I can't just stop doing it because all these people work for me. And, you get stuck in this fur-lined bear trap where things are comfortable, but there's no escape, right? And so it's really hard to get around that problem. It's hard to know yourself well enough to know what you like without trying everything when you simply can't. And what I've learned is that what you can do though is back off and say, well, what are the elements of a job that I really enjoy? What do I want the day-to-day existence to look like? Just as a very simple, for example, am I happy in front of a computer screen, or do I need to be face-to-face talking to people? Do I want lots of alone time, or do I like to be surrounded by people all day? And if you ask yourself those big questions, that lots of jobs fit those various answers, then you can at least winnow it down to a series of jobs that you actually would find enjoyable. And then really you should ask yourself, what are your strengths? So where will I stand out positively? I'm not a data guy. Let's not go that way. I am a person, whatever you are. And it may not get you to a career that you love, but if you get lucky, it will. But it also it will help you avoid careers that just don't suit you at all.
Yeah. And I do think you have to have an element of experimenting and being willing to try stuff. It's really, really hard to know without having done it. And so
Yeah.
I think you have to be okay with the fact that you probably won't get it right initially. There's a good chance you won't. If you do, great, but you may not, and it's completely okay, right? It's okay to
Yep.
try stuff, make a move, be committed when you're in, and really be reflective, but also know that most people don't get it exactly right away. And if you don't,
Yep.
that's okay. Bill, this is amazing. I
Yep.
know we're right at time, man. The book is called The Social Paradox: Autonomy, Connection, and Why We Need Both to Find Happiness. This is I'm often have PR people sending stuff my way, asking me to have people on my show. This is the opposite. I found Bill, I found his book. I was fascinated. I've heard you on other podcasts, Rogan and Chris and these guys, and thought, I got to talk to this guy, man. And you certainly delivered. I really appreciate you being here, man. I love your work, and I would love to continue our dialogue as we both progress.
Thanks, Ryan. Same. There's been tons of fun chatting about all this stuff. It's taken me in a direction I don't usually think about, which I find super interesting.
Love it. Awesome. Thank you so much, man.